I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator for the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. And I work on sustainable land use and wildfire mitigation for homeowners and residents of the wildland-urban interface and higher fire risk areas. So tonight we created this webinar to try to give people a better understanding of the ignition risk they can have on their property regarding wildfire, how to mitigate it, how to harden their home, and how to create a sustainable fire-wise landscape. So we will go over those topics this evening. I'm hoping to talk for no more than 40 minutes so that we can have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So first of all, a few little information about what the conservation district is. So Resource Conservation District, RCD for short, of the Santa Monica Mountains. It's a special district of the state of California. There are about 70, I believe, RCD throughout California. Our mission is to promote land stewardship and resource conservation. Very often we are seen as agencies that do the connection between state and federal agencies and the local communities on the ground. So we are obviously working with the Santa Monica Mountains communities and happy to help and support homeowners in the field of conservation and sustainable land use. Special districts are funded with a small portion through residents' property taxes. And the majority of our budget comes from grants from public agencies and foundations, education contracts, research and restoration services, as well as donations. So feel free if you want to make a contribution to the RCD, which is much welcome. You can do that at rcdsmm.org. And few examples on the projects we are working on. We have a team of biologists working on Malibu Lagoon Restoration Project, Oak Woodland Restoration Project, the Wildlife Crossing at Liberty Canyon. You may have heard of it. A lot of work went into this. We have very strong environmental education programs with place-based journalism and field trips and outdoor education programs. And we, of course, have fire resilience, outreach, and home ignition zone evaluations that I will be talking about later this evening. So during this evening, I will be talking about a website that we published back in September of last year, 2020. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge all the people and organizations that helped us as part of our technical advisory committee throughout the development of this website. So first, I want to go over a few basic concepts of the wildfire risk, and in order to give you a better understanding of what it is, in order to understand how you can mitigate it. So the wildfire risk, you can kind of like break it down in different components. The first one is the likelihood of the wildfire happening. So it's basically just the probability of the wildfire happening in a specific location. The intensity of the wildfire is the amount of energy that is released as the wildfire goes through the landscape. And usually, the more vegetation you have, the higher the energy release. The exposure to wildfire is very much linked to your location. If you live in an area that is adjacent to an open wildlands, or in what we call the wildland-urban interface, then you have a direct exposure to wildfire. You can have an indirect exposure to something that is also extremely important that we're going to talk about today, which is embers. Windblown embers are one of the main cause of house and structure ignitions during wildfires in Southern California. And finally, susceptibility, which is the likelihood of a community or structure to be damaged by a wildfire if it happens. It can be directly by the flames, or it can be through embers. So the risk itself is basically a combination of those four components of likelihood, intensity, exposure, and susceptibility. What you want to do is learn how you can mitigate those components. So the likelihood, you can't really do anything about it. If a wildfire is bound to happen in your location, it's going to happen. But you can, through home hardening, defensible space, and community preparedness, mitigate the intensity, the exposure, and the susceptibility of your house to be damaged by wildfire or by the embers. So when we talk about home hardening, and we'll go through that in more details, we talk about the maintenance, we talk about the use of fire-resistant materials, and ways to prevent ember intrusion by protecting your vents, by protecting the roofs using bird stopping techniques, anything that can prevent those embers from getting into the structure. The defensible space, which we will be talking about as well. Some of you are already familiar with the different zones, and we will have diagram explaining what are those zones and what are the recommendations for each one of those. We will talk about fire-wise landscaping, and the thing that is most important, maintenance and spacing. Proper maintenance and proper location of vegetation is key to have an effective fire-wise landscape. And finally, community, which is extremely important as well. You are only as safe as the weakest link in your community. So even if you've done all the work you can for your house, for home hardening and for fire-wise landscaping, if someone in your community is not aware of the best practices and how to mitigate the risk on their own property, you are still at risk. So that is something extremely important that we want people to understand and give you the tools to engage with your community, spread the word so that you can build a strong community altogether. So this is the homepage of the website I mentioned earlier, defensiblespace.org. There's a lot of information on this website. We talk about the home. On this section, we talk about the home hardening best practices. We talk about the landscaping, what it means to design a fire-wise landscape, what does it mean when you talk about fire-resistant plants, and we talk about maintenance. We have a section that is actually dedicated to plants, and another one for community, where we give you the tools to engage with your community, create a group, maybe start a local fire safe council, but you don't have to go that far to engage with your community. Even a small group of 8, 10 homeowners can already go a long way in terms of wildfire preparedness. So I'm going to start by sharing a video. It's a 30-second video, but it will give you a good understanding of how does a house catch fire. It's a video that was created by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, and I will let the video speak for itself. So that was a very short video, and in case you didn't, I should probably add the context before, but this video was created in a laboratory where they recreate windblown embers. So they build a structure, they build a landscape, and they bombard it with embers, see how ignition happens on the property. And what you saw is 2 different structures with 2 different landscape in the immediate proximity of the house, and how they responded to the embers. And obviously, one structure was catching fire pretty easily, when the other was actually resisting the wildfire. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the slides because of the video. So let me start again. There you go. Okay. So this is a summary of how a house can catch fire. So you can have three different ways of that happening. It can be through direct flame contact, so by having the wildfire actually reaching your property and your house. You can have it through embers, as we mentioned, and that is very often the case in Southern California, especially when we have wind-driven fires with the Santa Ana winds. That's when a lot of structures that can be several miles away from the fire front catch fire, which makes the job of firefighters even harder because then they have to deal with fires in different communities and different locations that they have to reach pretty quickly to avoid a whole neighborhood or community to completely catch fire and go up in flame. And finally, you have radiant heat. Radiant heat is when you have, for example, in that picture, a tool shed that caught fire from the embers or from direct flame contact. And the energy generated by that fire is eventually working on the structure the closest to it and igniting it because of the material that are being used that are probably not fire resistant enough. For example, if it's close to a window, that is a single pane window, the window can fail, and then you can have fire intrusion in the house and directly on the structure. So how do we avoid that? And yes, in LA County, more than half the houses that are damaged or destroyed by wildfires are ignited by embers. So embers are the thing you really want to pay attention to. So how do we avoid that? We're going to talk first about home hardening. So on the website, you're going to see a lot of diagrams and you're going to see a lot of information about the different features that you can harden on your home. I'm not going to go over all of them tonight. I'm going to go over the roof, the vents, the maintenance, a few of those, but I'm going to let you dive in the website later on and look through all of that information. I wanted to show you that diagram that is showing the relative cost of doing those kind of like upgrades, work on your house, versus the priority or how much attention you should be paying to it if you haven't upgraded those features yet. For example, if we look at the roof that is right there in the right-hand corner, redoing or upgrading your roof is extremely expensive. We know that. It's also one of the most effective way to protect your house if you have a roof currently that is not grade A fire-resistant material. So if you don't have a fire-resistant roof right now, you should consider the investment because it's one of the most effective way to reduce the risk of ignition of your property and of your home. On the other hand, one way that is pretty cheap is upgrading the vents. And we're going to talk about the vents extensively tonight because we mentioned embers, we mentioned wind-driven fire. So that's why the vents are extremely important in Southern California. And they're pretty inexpensive to upgrade. It's a lot to do with mesh screen. And I will be giving you more information about those. And more importantly, you see maintenance here in the corner, highest priority, lowest cost. Maintenance for the home and for the landscape is the most effective way to protect your home from wildfires and reduce the risk of ignition on your property. So right now, I'm going to give you a few examples about the roof and the vents. So for the roof, as I mentioned, you should consider, if you don't have that yet, replacing your roof with the class A roof, which means the highest grade in terms of fire resistance. You can use materials as composition, metal, tile. Asphalt shingles, I believe, are also a good material. Wood shake, wood shingles, obviously not great for ignition. So if you have those, consider upgrading your roof. Another very common upgrade for roofs that I see when I do home ignition zone evaluations is what we call bird stopping. So you see those little blocking the area right under the tile, initially preventing birds from making the nest under the tiles. They're also preventing embers from getting in there. So you're stopping two things. You're stopping vegetation debris and birds nesting who would bring vegetation debris under your tile, and you block embers from igniting those debris that are brought in by wind or by animals. So this one is actually pretty inexpensive to do and a very effective way also to reduce the ignition risk. Those are a few images to show you elements that you should be paying attention to when you go around your house and look at your roof or the overhang that you have. In that case, for example, that was a case with some water damage on an overhang. And here it's typical of an ideal case for amber intrusion. Like you will have embers getting in that little space right there, eventually igniting it from the inside and probably catching the whole structure. On the image on the right, you can see a lot of vegetation debris here. You have a lot of dead leaves that have been blown in by the wind, and it's right under an open eave made of wood. So here what is going to happen is where you have an accumulation of vegetation debris that have been brought in by the wind, that means the embers are going to get in there as well. The embers are going to ignite the debris, and then they're going to work the wood, eventually catching the structure. So you want to prevent that from happening by increasing the maintenance, and maybe even if you cannot close the eave completely, the ideal would be to do that. You can still add a mesh screen that would prevent the accumulation of vegetation debris in that little spot that we see very often on complex roofs. Now for the vents, depending on your house and the structure, you may have very different vents. There are all kinds of different types of the ridge, the attic, gable end vent are pretty common. Soffit are also pretty common, especially on houses that have eaves. Crawl spaces as well as the one shown on the picture here. For vents, in most cases, houses already have some sort of mesh screen or protection on the vents. But the protection that they have is usually a 1/4-inch mesh screen that is usually used against rodents. What you should have for amber intrusion, 1/4-inch is too big to prevent amber intrusion. So you want to have 1/8 of an inch mesh screen in order to really reduce the amount of amber that can go through your vents. So if they're not made of metal or non-combustible material, consider replacing even the frame of the vent with a metal or non-combustible material. Prevent the intrusion with a metal mesh. So as I mentioned, 1/8 of an inch is ideal. Don't use bigger than 1/8, but don't necessarily use smaller than 1/8 either, because then it can give you issues with airflow, and you don't want to have that happening at your house either. And you can also install shutters on your vents. Once again, make sure that if you do that, it will not impair the airflow of your structure. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the gutters. So very similar to the vents, you want to use non-combustible material. So you want to use galvanized steel, copper, aluminum. The reason you don't want to use, for example, plastic is that plastic can eventually melt. So imagine you have vegetation debris accumulating in the gutter. They are ignited by embers, and then they melt the gutter. this melted gutter can fall somewhere else on the structure or on your landscape and ignite the landscape, creating an even closer source of radiant heat, flame, and embers. So that's why you want to use material that will not melt and fall over if they are ignited. You should consider adding leaf guards on your gutters in order to prevent that accumulation of vegetation debris. Even once they are installed, you want to control them at least once a year, because some leaf guards can warp under the heat, they can be dislodged, and by doing that, they can actually become traps for vegetation debris. Like if they are a little warped, if they are upside down a little bit, then you can create a hazard as well. So you want to install them and control every year that they are in place so that you don't add another risk to your structure. And you can also install a drip edge on the gutter in order to protect the edge of the roof in case you have an ignition of the material, the vegetation debris that you have in the gutter. This edge would protect the roof from like the direct flame contact. And it was also minimize the ember intrusion that can be like right under the edge of the roof as well. So this is a screenshot. Don't try to read all of that slide. It's a screenshot of what you can see on the website. And I wanted to show you that for a few reasons. Is that at the very top here, so you see, we talk about the roof, we talk about the eaves, we talk about the gutters, the vents, the windows, the doors, the walls and the siding, the fence. So we really talk about all the architectural feature you want to harden and pay attention for your home. We have information for new construction, we have information for upgrades, and just general maintenance. So when you have some time, go on defensiblespace.org and feel free to go through all that information. This is another example of what you will find on the website under the maintenance section. So as I mentioned, you have a tab for new structure, you have one for upgrades, and you have one for maintenance. In that case, here on the left, we talk about the vents, and on the right, we talk about the gutters. So it's kind of like easy steps 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, kind of like a checklist you should consider when you are hardening your home. And a lot of them have to do with just maintenance. Like for example, here, number 1, remove vegetation debris. And if you look at the vents, it's the same thing. Number 3, vegetation debris again. And number 4, vegetation that can be near the vent openings. So you also want to trim those back. So yeah, maintenance is really the number 1 priority you should have when you go around and try to look at your structure for vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned, fortifying or retrofitting your home can be your best defense against ember intrusion. It doesn't necessarily apply big investments. Look at your budget, look at the different features you can upgrade, and usually you can find a sweet spot in there where you can be the most effective with the budget that you have. Maintenance is critical. The vents are critical for the wind-driven fires of Southern California. And if you need help trying to figure out how to prioritize, the RCD also offers home ignition zone evaluations free. So we can help you. We come to your home, we do an assessment, and we give you an order of a sense of the priorities you should have for your home. And very often, the priorities are very similar. We very often talk about the vents, but depending on your structure, it can be something very different. So you can go on the website of the RCD. I will show you the direct link later on in the presentation. Now we're going to talk about the landscape and what we call the defensible space. So when you go on the website, especially, you're going to see not just defensible space, but sustainable defensible space. So what do we mean by that? The sustainable defensible space, we look at the first 100 feet around the home. That's the area we focus on. The goal is to increase the home and community resistance to wildfire. So it's not just your home, it's also the home of your neighbors and the whole community. The goal of the defensible space is not just to reduce the risk of ignition on your property, it's also to make it more appealing to firefighters to come and defend your home. Like, it's designing a landscape that make them comfortable and feel safe. Like they feel they can come to your home, get a spot there and defend the community against wildfire. And finally, one of the most important part is also the habitat quality and resource conservation. So we want people to understand that you can design a landscape that is fire-wise and that at the same time supports the ecosystems of California. So now we'll talk about the different zones of the defensible space. So the goal of the defensible space in general is to reduce the risk of ignition, protect firefighters' life, and support native ecosystem, what I just mentioned. It starts with the home. That's why we talked about home hardening in the first place. The work on the home is part of that, reducing the ignition risk. Maintenance, I won't say it enough tonight, but maintenance is number one. And once you've done the work on your home, when you start looking outwards beyond the home, what are you looking for? So, and it's not just about the vegetation. We will talk about how you can choose the vegetation, choose the type of plant that you have, how you position them, how you space them, how you maintain them. Hardscape can also be a very good tool if you have pathways, if you have walkways that kind of like create separations within your landscape that can also help reduce the risk of ignition, or at least reduce the risk of the wildfire spreading on your property. We'll talk about native landscaping and the maintenance that goes with it. So the first zone, call it zone 0 or the amber resistant zone, it's the first 5 feet around your home, and they are critical. They are very critical because it's directly what is touching the structure. So you don't want something combustible in those 5 feet. You can see that I noted AB 3074. That is a new regulation in the state of California that passed earlier last year, I think in 2020, that is creating that zone officially. It's not yet enforced when firefighters, for example, do their home inspections. I believe CAL FIRE has a couple of years to come up with official guidelines about what it means to have this amber resistant zone. But the logic behind it is that you shouldn't have anything combustible in that area. Anything combustible being plants or furniture or anything that can catch fire. So no vegetation, no mulch in that area either. You can have non-organic mulch. You can have gravel. You can have stone walkways or pathways. You can have all of that, but absolutely avoid having organic mulch or bark chips in that area, because that's the best way to invite the fire right to the siding of your home. Beyond the 5 feet, we have the zone called, so zone 1, or the home protection zone. That zone goes from 5 to 30 feet if you're on the flat, or if you're on a slope of more than 20%, you should extend that zone to about 50 feet. So 5 to 30 or 5 to 50, depending on your slope. That zone should be lean, clean, green. So extremely well-maintained plant, well irrigated, well spaced, ideally green all year long. You ideally need to think about the density of the planting. So the idea when you have those defensible space zone is to start with low density, low growing plants. And as you move outwards, that get closer to the natural environment, then you can increase density. You can have bigger plants, you can have trees. Ideally, don't have trees within the first 10 feet. Start having trees after the 10 feet from the home. and increase the density as you move outwards. Think in terms of islands of vegetation. I mentioned hardscape, I mentioned gravel or stone walkways. Those are ideals to design a firewise landscape. You can have like patches of vegetation that you separate with those hardscape features, so that if you have a patch of vegetation that is ignited by the embers, it's somehow contained. It doesn't mean that it's not going to jump onto another patch, but it reduces the risk of it doing so. And so you reduce the risk of a wildfire spreading unobstructed on your property. And proper spacing and maintenance. And if you go on defensiblespace.org, you will see additional diagrams showing you how to properly space different plants and how to create both horizontal and vertical clearance between the plants, so that they don't you kind of like break the continuity of the wildfire. Zone 2, the thinning zone, that goes from 30 or 50 feet depending on your slope to 100 feet from the house. So in that zone, you don't necessarily want to do extensive vegetation work. You want to do some thinning work. You want to make sure that you remove all ladder fuels that you may have, which is if you have a tree, for example, and you have a shrub that is right underneath that tree, you want to make sure that you have enough clearance between the highest point of the shrub and the lowest branches of the tree, so that if that shrub catches fire, it doesn't transmit the fire to the canopy of the tree, because then you have a much bigger problem on your hand. So proper spacing, maintenance, removing ladder fuels, and use more and more native plants, native species, in order to really create that ecological transition from your house to the natural environment. That you can have ornamental species closer to your home, but the ideal is if you can use native plants all around, that's best. But if you can do that kind of transition of having the ornamental closer to your house and the native plants more and more as you move outwards, that's the idea. Absolutely avoid invasive species. Those are extremely dangerous for ecosystems, and you don't want those in your landscape. And on the website, we have a list of the most common invasive species that you should avoid in order to protect the natural environment. And finally, we reach, beyond 100 feet, we reach the surrounding wetlands. So there's a caveat here that any fire departments, at least in LA County, can require up to 200 feet of defensible space. So depending on the condition of your slope, depending on the vegetation, depending on the area where you are located, they may ask you to do additional thinning up to 200 feet from your home. So in case of doubt, check with the local fire departments, and they will give you additional guidelines. Otherwise, if you don't have additional guidelines from them, focus on removing invasive species, doing very minimal thinning, but really not that much. There are a good amount of studies now that shows that whatever type of vegetation you have beyond 100 feet, it doesn't impact the survivability of the structure. Like, what is the most important is what you have within this first 100 feet. So really focus on the maintenance of those. And most properties don't reach 100 feet of landscape anyway, especially if you live in a community that is more an interface community that really within the wildland, you usually don't have 100 feet of landscape to maintain. And so as you see those different zones, some of them can overlap with your neighbors. So try to work together, engage with them to try to find the best way to minimize the risk for your property that may be adjacent, so that you reduce the risk for everyone. In any case, do not remove vegetation down to bare soil. Like, do not do moonscaping. Some people believe that by removing all of the vegetation, you actually increase the protection. That is not proven, and actually the opposite sometimes is proven, that by removing all type of vegetation, you create a sort of highway for the embers to just like fly through the landscape and reach your property much easier than if they had vegetation in the way. So no moonscaping, especially if you are on a hillside, because then you would have a lot of problems with erosion and slope stability. So this is that is a little blurry. Sorry about that. It's another screenshot from our website from the plant section. So what is important here is not is what written here, but the different tabs that you have. So plant characteristic, native plants, invasive species, protected species, oak woodland, water and irrigation. So kind of like something about smart irrigation system, and pest management. So as you see, we have a lot of information on that website, not just about home hardening, not just about wildfire, but also about native ecosystems of Southern California. And you see that question here about what is a fire-resistant plant. So very often you will see plant lists that are recommended to use in your landscape in order to reduce the risk of ignition, of the risk of wildfire. The thing is, very often people think of those plant lists as like a silver bullet against wildfire, and they are not. Any plant will burn, and in most cases, it has to do with the conditions, not so much about the species. So it's really about the maintenance. Like, is your plant positioned in a good location? Is it well trimmed? Is it well maintained? Is it well irrigated? All those questions will determine the fire resistance of your plant, not necessarily the species itself. So keep in mind, any plant will burn. It's mostly to do with the maintenance. That is a little diagram that you will find on our website. Can be a little complicated to understand at first, but the key takeaway message here is about the seasonality and the different maintenance that you should be doing in the winter, in the spring, summer, or fall to really reduce the flammability of the plants you have in your landscape. Plants have some inherent characteristic that will make them more flammable. Like you have some plants that have some oils or chemical content that will ignite more easily than others. Some have a morphology, type of shape, a structure that will also make them more fire prone. For example, if they have very low hanging branches, that may be a risk to catch fire from a surface fire, for example. So you want to pay attention to those. You want to clear the lowest branches so that you don't have that connection straight to the ground. You want to keep them well irrigated so that the moisture content stay high. And you want to remove any type of dead material or dry bits in your plants so that you really reduce what can ignite and what can burn. That's another slide about native plants. So keep in mind that native plants supports native wildlife, and they are critical in the Santa Monica Mountains. We have a lot of habitat fragmentation in the Santa Monica Mountains and in Southern California in general with all the urban developments. So anything we can do to support local ecosystem by using native plants, we should be doing it. This is also a slide, and sorry about the quality, a list of the benefits of using the native plants. So not only is it supporting critical ecosystem services in our area, it's also usually they require less water. They actually require less maintenance. You can keep them and maintain without pesticides usually, and they are just a great added values for wildlife seeing. You will have birds, you will have deer, you will have multiple insects, monarch butterflies. All of those will come to your garden by using native plants. So now I've been talking for a while already, so I'm going to go short on this, the home ignition zone evaluation, which is a service we offer at the RCD. So here I'm going to show you a few images that things we see on evaluations. So in that case, for example, you can see that the structure itself is pretty fire resistant, but you see what's in the gutter. You have a ton of pine needles there waiting to be ignited from embers. And then even if you have a relatively fire-resistant structure, the fact that you have a fire, and here you have a good amount of material, you have a good amount of fuel that can burn, so you will have a lot of energy release. Eventually that can catch the roof even with a grade A roof. So in that case, adding leaf guards and increasing maintenance. It's a bit tricky because they are surrounded by pine trees, but that is the best recommendation they can have for now. Here it's about windows and the frame of windows. Here you see you have little gaps right between the siding and the window frame. Those can be ember traps. And what was interesting on the house is that some of the frames were in that shape and some were, well, they had caulking material and they had filled those little gaps. So you don't want to have those openings. You want to be like on the second images with those fixed so that you don't have embers getting just behind the frame. Here's an image of a tree that can be problematic on a property. I think it's a Canary Island palm tree. They have a lot of material that can ignite from the embers. And so the risk that you have when you have that on your property, not only can they drop fronds and vegetation debris on your roof, they can ignite very easily from the embers and then they become a source of embers right next to your structure. Ideally, you don't want to have those trees close to your structure. And when you do, you want to make sure that your home is extremely hardened by looking at the gutters, looking at the roof, looking at anything that can catch from embers that would be generated by that plant. Here another example of another tree basically touching the structure. So you don't want to have that. Here it's a disaster waiting to happen because it's touching the structure, it's touching the window. The heat that would be generated from that tree catching fire would be so high that it's very likely going to break the window and create an intrusion into the home. So that's why you don't want to have trees too close to your home, because then when they grow taller, then you encounter that type of issue. Here it's more of a little deck stepping area. On the outside, so on the left, you can see, well, it looks clean. There doesn't seem to be dead leaves of dead vegetation. But when you look inside, which is this photo on the right, you see that there are some dead materials in there, some dead leaves. And those can also ignite from the embers because there are a lot of openings for embers to get on the ground and ignite those. So they would ignite that kind of like wood structure. And then the frame of the window of that structure was also made of wood. So then you will have a direct connection, burning the little steps, the little deck, burning the frame, eventually catching the structure. We talk a lot about decks when we do the home ignition zone evaluations. And here in that case, you can see that you have some patches of vegetation right at the base of the pillar. Even if you have a good vertical clearance, like the deck is not touching the ground, which is pretty good usually. But because you have those plants right at the base, you can have ember accumulating at the base, catching the pillar, and then the whole deck can go up in flame. So in that case, the recommendation will be to clear the area around the pillar at the base to make sure that they won't catch fire from vegetation accumulation. Same thing on the right side. Here, you definitely want to remove that plant. I don't remember, I think it might have been jasmine. You want to remove it because it's right under the deck. It's climbing through the deck. It's ideal for embers to catch and eventually catch the whole structure. Here another example, and a problem that many people have when it comes to storing material. You don't want to store pile of firewood against the fence, especially if the fence is made of wood itself, so it's a highly combustible material, and if the fence is connected to the house, which was the case on that property. Because what is going to happen, embers are going to ignite the firewood, are going to ignite the fence, and then the fire is going to be directly transmitted to the house through the fence. So you definitely want to avoid that, relocate your pile of firewood, and create a disconnection on your fence, for example, by having a metal gate, a non-combustible material gate between the rest of the fence and your structure, so that you have some separation and you don't have direct contact in case the fence catches fire. This one doesn't really need explanations. It's kind of like a combination of all the things you should not be doing. You basically have a pile of dead material, pine needles, dead wood branches, stored material against the siding of the home. So maintenance, make sure that you don't have that around your structure. Clean out the immediate proximity of your house, remove the ladders, remove the chairs that you have, remove the firewood. This is like very bad when you come to wildfire resilience. This is another example of vegetation that is not maintained. So in that case, you have a house that even have open eaves, so that is even more dangerous for embers and wildfire ignition. But you have a bougainvillea, you have very dense, very thick vegetation with a lot of dead material in there. So here you definitely want to clean that vegetation. You want to trim them down. You want to remove all the dead vegetation, and you want to make sure that the first 5 feet around your home don't have any of that vegetation. That is an example of neighbor-to-neighbor relationship. Here you have a case of that structure pergola with like an overgrown plants with a lot of dried parts as well. And in that case, it was on the neighbor property. So you need to have discussions with your neighbors when you have things like that happening in between your structure, because it's posing a risk to both of you. So you don't want to have that kind of structure in between houses, trying to think like, oh, well, this is my neighbor, I can't do anything about it. You should try to engage with them because you don't want your house to catch fire. They don't want their house to catch fire either. So you need to mitigate the risk as a group and as a community. And finally, that was a photo that you will see it's a pretty well-maintained landscape. Even if you look at the vegetation that is right next to the house, you see that the lowest branches have been trimmed. You see that you don't have vegetation debris accumulation, but you still have a lot of vegetation material within the first 5 feet, and especially right under a window. In that case, the window was a dual pane, which is what would be recommended in fire zones. But you can see the size, it's a very large window. So if that landscape, for some reason, catches fire from the embers, the radiant heat from the energy that is released by those plants can still break that window. The differential of temperature between the different panes can be so high that the window is going to fail. And then you have an intrusion, an ember intrusion and an entry point for wildfire. So you want to move those plants away so that you don't have that source of potential radiant heat so close to your structure and to vulnerable entry points. This is kind of like an example that I found on the Los Angeles Park Foundation that is kind of like giving you an idea of what is that first 5 feet zone. So here in that case, you see there's no vegetation. They have some hardscape walkway. They have a fountain in the back. And then they have those patches of vegetation. And you see even the patches of vegetation are very well maintained. They're pretty low growing as you start at the 5 feet zone. And then the density kind of like increases. You have like larger shrubs, you have larger trees. So that is a kind of landscape that you want to think about. It seemed that there is no break, like it's a continuous landscape. So if you want to really make it fire-wise, you probably want to create some additional walkways and breaks within the vegetation patches. But it's kind of like the philosophy you want to go for. That is another example of a 0 to 5 feet zone that would be fire-wise. So using very low growing plants, usually with very high water content as well, and a lot of rocks like hardscape, kind of like stones to give shape to the landscape that you have. And then past the 5 feet and past the walkway, you have trees, you have shrubs, and you have the landscape starting, but you don't have it right next to your structure. That's another example as well. And this example is especially interesting because of the use of mulch that they have. So you see that first, as you move away from the deck, you don't have any mulch, and the mulch starts about like 5 to 10 feet away from the deck, even if the deck is made apparently of concrete or non-combustible material. So when you're using mulch, which is very good for the soil, you want to use composted mulch. You don't want to use the bark chips, and you want to use it in a location that is kind of like remote from your structure. And finally, that's a view from the top of Topanga, I think. And what's interesting, it's kind of like the zone 2, the zone that would be like between the 50 to 100 feet, or even 200 feet, depending on the fire department's requirements. But you can see kind of how they thin the landscape. So here on the foreground, you see you still have native vegetation. It's thin, it's maintained, so you have breaks between the shrubs, but it's not moonscaped. On the hill that you can see across with the house over there, in some areas you may think they've been a little excessive on the amount of clearance they've done, but you still see that kind of gradient as you move away from the house, where they have very sparse shrubs or trees closer to the house, and then it increases in density. You have more trees, and then you go into the natural chaparral landscape. So it's kind of this idea of gradient and evolution of the density as you move away from the house. So I mentioned the home ignition zone evaluation. So you can book one online. You go on the website of the RCD, rcdsmm.org. You go under services right there, home ignition zone evaluations. And as you scroll down that page, you will have a button to book an evaluation on our automatic system. If you have an issue with the automatic system, feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to do the booking for you. The service is free for now. It is funded through a grant, so until we exhaust the fund of the grant, we will offer the service for free. We have done about 56 evaluations so far, so we have still a good amount of funding to provide this service. The evaluation lasts for about an hour and a half, and at the end of it, you will receive a report, a personalized report with the top 5 recommendations of things you should be considering to harden your home. And yeah, and I think I actually saw a question about the training. And yes, all our evaluators, so myself, we went through a training by the National Fire Protection Association, VNFPA, about home ignition zones. So all our volunteers and myself are trained, and they are pretty amazing people to do the assessments. So yeah, I think that's it. I spoke for longer than I should. For more information, go on defensiblespace.org and use my email if you have any questions. And now I'm going to try to look at the chat and see the question that we have. But Marcia, if you are here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So a couple of questions. I know you mentioned the AB 3074. Are there any other city requirements for house hardening?
Well, I'm not aware of all the city regulation. For the city of LA, I don't think they have one yet. I will double check that, but I don't think they do. No.
Okay. And one person did ask about FOSS check. And spraying, because there is one site where they're recommending that it be sprayed on the roof, but potentially every 6 months. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So we get that question quite a lot about first check of the type of like things you can apply seasonally to reduce the risk of ignition. We don't tell people not to do it, but because everything costs money, sometimes you are better investing in upgrading your vents, upgrading your gutters, upgrading other architectural feature, or even spending it on the landscape, rather than spending it on something that you have to reapply twice a year. So if you've done everything already on your home, if you've done the work of home hardening, if you've done the Firewise landscaping, and you want something additional to it, go for it. But if you are on a limited budget, look first at what you can do, like the low hanging fruits, before going to that route.
Thank you. And the only other thing possibly is what is the source of a lot of the information that's on defensiblespace.org? Who's accumulated that information?
So all our sources are listed as you go through a website. I I compiled all that information. So we got a lot of information from University of California, from fire departments, from nonprofits like California Native Plant Society and Theodore Payne Foundation. We worked with regional planning as well. So a lot of agencies and organizations, and they are all listed on our website, and they were part of our technical advisory committee as well.
Great. Well, that was it. Those were all the questions. Thank you so much for your time. We are very grateful.
Great. Well, yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we will end it
Oh,
there.
wait, sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. She asked the person that asked about the source. Let me just read you. She says, can you tell us the source of the graph that displays the priority / relative cost for the different hard homeoning measures?
Mhm. So that diagram was created using two different sources. We used a report from the University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources Department and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Like by combining basically the cost that were estimated by the IBHS and the kind of like list of priority that the University of California came up with, combining those, we created that plot diagram.
Thank you. And so we will, let me see so is it Defensible Space? Can you just repeat again the website where people can sign up for the house hardening inspections?
So let me go back a couple slides maybe, if I can.
And for those people that are listening that are part of Castellamare Mesa, we will be offering that through the HOA as well, that we have arranged with Antoine. So if you're in Castellamare, you can contact either myself or Cindy.
So yeah, the website, you go on the RCD website. So it's rcdsmm.org, listed right there. You go in the services tab, and at the bottom you will have home ignition zone evaluations. And if you don't find it, again, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to do it.
Great. So last question, what suggestions do you have for moonscape canyon near sorry, let me read. What suggestions do you have for moonscaped canyon near housing, low water and low maintenance plants? Is there a page on the website that people could refer to?
Yeah, and I can send the link directly, but we have a list of a few native plants that are known as soil keepers. So they have a root system that is usually pretty good for hillsides. And we can, through the grant that is funding that work of home ignition zone evaluations, we also have some money, not too much, but a little bit, for restoration, especially areas that have been damaged by wildfire or just bare landscape that can pose a threat for erosion and slope stability.
So maybe that person can contact you directly.
Yeah, and I know the person, so I'll make sure to pass on the information.
And lastly, can you tell people where you recorded this? Can you tell people where it can be found for later listening?
So I don't know yet. I'm hoping to put it at least on the website of the RCD, but if not, we'll try to put it on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, and thank you everybody that joined us this evening.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you, everybody. And yes, so you have my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any question. And I hope to do many more webinars with this type of information. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Antoine.